So I just would like to say hello, of course, to the viewers and introduce myself, Associate Professor Cathy Bettman. I'm here in my capacity as a member of the Research Committee of the National Heads of Counselling and Psychotherapy Educators. And I'd like to mention my affiliations to Ken Miller and to PACFA. But I'm really happy and excited today to be talking with Associate Professor Shannon Hodges. So welcome, Shannon. And as we've agreed, I'd love you to be able to introduce yourself to the viewers.
Well, first of all, thank you for this opportunity, Cathy. I'm glad to sit down. And I think that you're doing some important work with these videos and these interviews because they give a human face both to the profession and research and all that we do. So I think so I'm very happy to be here, and I think that's very important. And Shannon Hodges, this is my another iteration in my career. I retired a little over a year ago as professor of clinical mental health counseling at Niagara University in Niagara Falls area in New York, on the New York side. And I've spent a career running programs, doing research, teaching, all sorts of things, consulting the world over, including quite a bit here in Australia. And that's what led me down to Australia. Was I enjoyed Australia. I taught on two different sabbaticals, one in Fremantle for Notre Dame and one down in Canberra. And I did a lot of trauma consulting work, training, suicide prevention in remote Indigenous schools in the Northern Territory. I've done that also in South African orphanages and many other places. So, but I will finish that part with this thing. I do not know everything. It shouldn't shock anybody who might see this video, but I always like to say that because I would say I'm knowledgeable, but I don't know that there are ever truly any experts on human behavior. But there are people like myself, Cathy, and many other people out there in the profession and related professions, and we are knowledgeable. So I'll go with that.
It's a really interesting point, though, because I think the more that you learn, the more that you study, the more you realize that you don't know everything.
Amen. Amen.
For sure. So I think it would be really interesting probably to the viewers, I expect, that might watch this, to talk a little bit about, there's so much emphasis, well, difference, maybe discussion around psychotherapy and counseling. And, you know, we always have students who will say, what's the difference? And certainly in all countries, it's viewed differently. So tell us a little bit about, you know, your experience, although you've been here, there, and everywhere, but particularly in the States. What have you found about the difference between psychotherapy and counseling, and how do you regard yourself?
Well, in the States, I'd say it's very clear, and here's what it depends on. What state or territory are you credentialed in?
Wow.
And let me say about that, in New York State, in the states and the territories, all 50 states have what's called licensure for counselors, just like they do for social work and psychology. 3 territories, Washington, D.C., Puerto Rico, Guam, and soon to be U.S. Virgin Islands. So there'll be a 4th. So anyway, but some states like New York State say, if you have the licensure, you can call yourself a counselor or a psychotherapist. Some states would say you can only call yourself a licensed counselor. And then we have, because also on the border with the Canadian province of Ontario, the entire credential they got over there was registered psychotherapist. So in the United States, and at least part of Canada, it tends to be dictated, the term, by where you live. And otherwise, it's interchangeable. So if you don't have the legal issue, it's interchangeable, because what we're doing in the States, when we're doing counseling and someone else is doing psycho, there really isn't any functional difference other than the term. So I know that's not the case here in Australia. But in the United States, again, it's one of those differences. And I think it's a reflection of the United States profession really counseling profession being born in 1952 and much older. So that's a lot of the differences. There is one other nuance I'd throw in to that. In the United States, just like psychologists, who are a doctoral profession in the US, not a master's, the two professions that provide almost all counseling are social work and counselors, and those two professions are really close in number, and counseling is the number 2 profession. Because of that, counselors and social workers, primary master's professionals, they diagnose just like psychologists and psychiatrists. And the research on that is the counselors do it just as bad or just as good as the other two. So those are some of the other nuances that are evolved. It used to be you had to have the psychotherapist part to credential as a counselor, but that's changed. So the counselors are doing that in all those states and territories now.
But would you say then that maybe some of the requirements of psychotherapy here are kind of inbuilt anyway into a counseling qualification? Like you mentioned a PhD, but I'm thinking here, if you think very quickly, very briefly, the difference, I think it's kind of seen as working at a much deeper level, but also a much greater requirement on self as counselor and doing our own work and making sure that we've had our own therapy before we can call ourselves psychotherapists. Does that enter the picture at all in the US?
Well, in the US, it's pretty much required by programs when you're going through it to do it at least a few sessions. But I was finding the requirement was unnecessary and we took it off because everybody literally who came into the program had been in counseling. And because it's so ubiquitous and so common in the United States. I would say, again, it could just be a cultural difference, but in the United States, the difference that I've seen working across the United States, and that's in states like Oregon and Idaho, Vermont and New York and Minnesota and some others, I would say the differences are pretty much very slight and very nuanced. The curriculum is pretty much the same. And because what you're having to do is meet that state licensure requirement. There is one difference in the state of New York and maybe a few others. They have this licensure for licensed psychoanalysts who are people who are not psychiatrists. Maybe they're a physician or a counselor, someone who wants neo-Freudian type training. And that's the only time I can think that's noticeably different. Otherwise, it's really in name only in the US.
So you mentioned a little bit around diagnosis.
Mm-hmm.
Is there then the marked difference in the US between counselors / psychotherapists and psychologists?
The biggest difference, I would say, in the United States is psychologists have to have a doctorate degree to practice, other than school psychology. But school psychologists are, the masters are very limited school. I taught students who were in a master's school psych program as well. They took one of my classes. The school counselors took a couple of my classes. But anyway, the biggest difference in the United States is most psychologists get very little counseling training. That would surprise most people. Their primary strength tends to be in assessment. Now, they get some counseling training, but nowhere near as much as the counselors. And one of my friends who's a counseling psychologist and taught with me, close friend, she and I used to joke, we wanted to write an article in the American Psychologist entitled it, Where's the Counseling in Counseling Psychology? Because when she went through her PhD in counseling psychology, she didn't get any, she had a couple of courses that said they were counseling courses. They didn't do any counseling. And when she asked her professor, why aren't we learning about counseling? Her professor said, oh, that's just common sense, which is ridiculous in my view and her view. But the biggest difference is the psychologist, counseling is an ancillary part of what they're doing, not a great part of what they're training in APA approved programs. It's the other thing I would add for clinical psychology, and I'll be a little briefer, but clinical psychologists, I think in 6 US states now, can prescribe psychoactive medication. So the big battle for psychologists is clinical psychology with psychiatry. If I'm a psychiatrist, I'm wondering what's going on here. For counselors and psych, we get along well because we don't have any big issues anymore.
Okay. But what about things like if somebody goes to their GP and the GP suggests that they have counseling? We have the issue here with Medicare problems and psychologists, yes, and counselors, no. Does that exist in the States?
Well, in the States, Medicare is for elderly. So you're going to have to be at least in your 60s, generally 65. Now, counselors just recently got the right to bill Medicare also. That was the last big goal, and the counselors got it before I came down. But let me go back to what you're saying.
Yeah.
Counselors are billing everything just like the psychologist. And because we're the second largest profession and we've gotten quite popular, my experience is what you just mentioned is far less than it would have been a few years ago. And in fact, in New York State, in my area, we were one of the last states to provide counselors the right to have a license, diagnose, and all that. They seem to be as popular as the social workers, and New York is the social workers' biggest, but we're catching up. So right now we've got counselors who are in practice back in Niagara Falls area and Buffalo and across the state who are in practice with physicians. So that's shifted a great deal at this point. And so in the United States right now, I would say for the most way we look at it, counselors have achieved parity and they are poised to zoom past their colleagues because they're outgrowing their colleagues.
Oh,
So
wow.
so there is, Cathy, there is some of that still, I think, maybe in California, which was the last state to pass licensure in 2009 late, but it's changing quite a bit. We're very much in the forefront at this point.
Wow, it's so interesting course. A piece of research I'm just doing, talking to counselors, what they charge and what they feel they can charge is a big issue for them. Whereas when you go to a psychologist, there doesn't seem to be the hesitation around $250 an hour, whereas counselors go more than $100 and $150. That's kind of like what they feel they better not go more than that. So it doesn't sound like there's that difference in the States.
There would be there because one of the things that the psychologist is going to do, for example, if someone gets sent to a psychologist for a psychological evaluation, they may charge $400 to $500 an hour for that, depending on where they're at. Now, if you're in a poor state like Southern Arkansas, where I come from, you're not going to be able to do that. If you're in New York City, God knows what it'll be. But yeah, you'd have that because the healthcare system in the United States is fragmented. It's a for-profit system other than Medicare, Medicaid, TRICARE. TRICARE is Medicare in the military. But the counselors are usually capped and social workers are usually capped at the same level. Although I have to tell you, it's not that bad. They do pretty well. The other thing I'd say is that's happened in the United States is this. There is a niche market for counselors who don't bill health insurance. And there's a reason a lot of people would rather the provider not bill health insurance. And one of those reasons is that a diagnosis or something, even though when the person works through it, can stay on their record for a lifetime. And that can be problematic sometimes.
Okay.
So I'll give you an example. I've got a student in the Buffalo, New York area, which is close to Niagara Falls. Buffalo is a mid-sized city, but very active. She's got a private practice after working 4 years and doing trauma work. She does individual therapy on Zoom and in person. She also has a walk and talk practice with a lot of athletes who prefer it, and a lot of people with anxiety. Now they have to sign waivers that they might be noticed and how they deal with that. She also works part-time at a Boys and Girls Club in her old hometown just south of Buffalo, where she provides group therapy and also person. She does all these different things. She has a waiting list. And she comes from a wealthy family. Her parents talked to me one time when she graduated about, I hope she's going to be able to make a living. Well, she's doing really, really well. In fact, she said to me, this is the way to do it because I can charge what I want. I can take poor clients who can't pay, but I'm doing really well with this. And so I don't think it's the same issue as it would have been in the past. Granted, with again, the more comparable situation in the US is with social work, because while we're very different in training, the how we're paid and such at this point tends to be pretty similar, pretty much the same these days. Psychology, because they're a doctor level profession and do all those fancy assessments and such, it's totally a different ball of wax, and they can make so much more money doing that than doing counseling anyway.
Oh boy, I mean, that's a subject we could go on and on about. But what I'm also interested in is research,
Mhm.
research in the US. I don't know where to begin. Should we first talk about how did you get into research and what are your particular areas of interest in research?
I'm glad you said areas because I've never had the one. Kathy, when I was in first grade on our report cards, on the very back of the card, there was a note that the teacher could write to the parents. My grandparents were raising me and four of my brothers. And at the very last marking period of the end of year one, the teacher wrote on there, she said, Shannon is capable, very capable little boy, but he can never stay within the lines in terms of when I have him doing a sign, he just goes beyond them. Now, I'm good at respecting people's personal boundaries. That I'm good at doing. But I could never have one research. I started out, I thought I was going to be an administrator at the university, and counseling was a good field for that because you have so many mental health issues. So I was looking at multicultural comfort and researching that. And then after that line went dry, I started researching other things like emotional regulation and such. And my colleagues and I did really well, won a couple of national awards, but didn't do anything for our program. And then I started but I went back to my original interest, which was purpose and meaning in life, and was doing that and following that out. I also wrote a lot of opinion articles about the future of counseling and where it was going. And the future of counseling as a global network. I had a national column in our national magazine, Counseling Today, for 3 years, and that was a lot of fun, but exhausting. But how I got into it was this way. I'll get around answering your question finally. So, um, I thought I wanted to do was be a practitioner. Either as a dean of students and later as a counselor. And I did a lot of that around the University Counseling Center, around a county mental health clinic. But I found out I wanted to teach full time and I had to do research and found out I was a good writer. But and so I got into it because I had to do it to work at the university level and found out I was pretty good at it. But the big passion was I loved teaching and I loved counseling. So I did it so I could do those. And there's a lot of, in the United States, there's a number of journals, there's a lot of research. Counselors are doing quite a bit of that now. Granted, they got a late start, but doing quite a bit of that. But again, it's the maturation of the profession. That's where Australia is at. There's still a profession, far better than that, still maturing and whatnot. But I got into it for a totally different reason. You know?
Okay, so that's interesting. I mean, you speaking about working then as an academic and needing to do research for that purpose. But what about, and you say it's happening. How
Mhm.
did this come about? Was it because students, and you spoke about a PhD for counseling, so
Uh,
was it that it was a required part of their counseling training? I mean, you also spoke about just wanting to be a practitioner, and that's what we get from a lot of students. Why do we have to do research? We want to be a practitioner. So how does that kind of come together in the States?
Yeah, it's a good question. I can tell you what really helped more than anything was doctoral degrees in counselor education and supervision became common as the profession increased. Right now, I looked it up recently because I'm working on this article with some of us, and there are 1,500 counseling degree programs in the United States at the master's level. Counseling programs at the baccalaureate level are almost unheard of, but master's level are most common, and PhD. So the PhD in counselor ed is the requirement. So at the PhD level, there's doctoral level training in supervision because there's very good training in that and in research. So you're doing research as a PhD student, your dissertation. You also have to write a research article, just like what we do with our master's programs here and and others. So you have a lot of people out there and counseling has become a research discipline. The biggest thing that helped, though, the growth in the field meant we could get more people out there, more doctoral programs in counselor ed and supervision. And then what happened was the accreditation decided, okay, Anybody teaching in one of these programs full time and in a tenure track, or what we call in the United States position, has to have a doctorate in counselor education, not counseling psychology. So the research ballooned after that, and you had various other counseling research journals and related journals they could do it in, and also you had the numbers doing it. So it's really a lot of all of those. Again, a big part of that was counseling as a profession becoming so popular that we needed more of these programs, needed more training programs at the doctorate level, needed more journals. And that's a lot of it. It's just sort of a wave, throw a rock in the pond, and then those waves spread out, and that's what happened.
So what do you think the reason is that made counseling, become so popular?
I think the 1960s was really, and I was born in 1960, so I'm going on some of my older colleagues and what I've gleaned from research. You had a lot of people who self-identified with the counseling movement and less the psychology. Then a couple of three really famous names. One was Carl Rogers. He said, the counseling profession is where it's at. It's more of what I want to do. And he came to our national conference every year until he died. You had William Glasser, who would say, I'm a psychiatrist by training, I'm a counselor by choice. And Dr. Glasser, I've talked with him a few times. He was a very difficult man, very smart, didn't suffer fools very easily, but he was absolutely 100% loyal to the counseling profession and said, this is who I refer people to as a psychiatrist. And I call myself a counselor. Then you had other people. Albert Ellis would come almost every year. He was one of our legends, and his widow has been very good too. She's Australian, by the way. And there were some other people. Now, those were three really big names, and they really helped. And so the 1960s, the encountering movement also really pushed it out, counseling, and then pretty soon more and more of these counseling programs, plus for social work and psychology and psychiatry. And psychiatrists in the United States get almost no counseling training unless they go to a postdoctoral program. They really weren't giving much training in counseling and still aren't in the programs and professions I've seen. I think that they do a fine job. I don't want to throw any shade on those three professions, but I tell people and counselors, because our specialty is counseling, that's another reason it's become so popular.
So here you are. I mean, you've come to Australia, you're at a university, you're teaching again. What happened I'm curious about what happened to retirement, but it seems like you're pretty busy. And I was just wondering, like, your views, because here we used to, and still sometimes do, but more often in the past, we used to have the opportunity within a master's degree to offer a fairly substantial research program, very often 3 semesters or 3 trimesters, where they got a touch of the theory, and then they were actually thrown into doing a research project. And like you spoke about before, maybe even writing a journal article. And as we're going along, that seems to be pushed out more and more. It's very time consuming for a lecturer, but also so much else is needed to be crammed into a master's program. And of course, there's no absolute requirement for a PhD. So what are you thinking about all that? What would you be encouraging us to be doing here in Australia?
Well, first thing I want to honor, Cathy, is the situation. Australia and the United States are similar to, but different from. So I'm still learning. I have to just be honest about that. Some things that we do in these states won't work so well here. It's kind of like when I've still got, like my electric shaver, I had to get an adapter to plug it in and make it work. So adaptations have to be made. In the United States, and I'd say this, master's degree programs are practitioner based. They get training, I get the odd course in research methods, but they're not, when they go out there into an agency and they're doing 6-7 hours a day of counseling, they just don't have the time to do research. That's what's done in the doctoral programs. That's what's done at the universities, people like us and that kind of thing. Now, I know the situation's a little different because I had a conversation with my colleague about that. But the challenge, I would say, it's really hard to build a research field with people with master's degrees because what they're doing so much of the time is spending so much of their day doing full-time individual group counseling work. It in the States, it really has to be people who don't have that load, who are faculty people like us, or those working maybe in a research oriented program, or it's otherwise it's just really hard to do. And I know how hard it is to do because when I was out post PhD, I took a couple of years and ran a clinic, taught part-time at a TAFE-like institution and published articles in journals, but it was really hard to do that. I was single then, and I didn't have any kids or anything, but it was really hard. It just isn't realistic to think we can build a research field based on master's level people, in my opinion and my experience.
So you think that needs to change, that people will need to be qualified, have a PhD in order to be accredited as a registered clinician?
Well, not necessarily, because in the United States, the licensure is at the master's degree, just like social work and marriage and family therapy. These are all master's level credentials. But to be a full-time, like for example, if you're going to teach in an accredited program in the United States, and the accreditor is KCREB, better known as the acronym because the names are archaic, but KCREB has gotten rather strong. They say you have to hire a faculty person who has a doctorate degree in counselor education or counseling. And you can't hire a full-time person with a master's degree in a tenure level position. You could hire them to teach as a sessional part-time or in some other role, but to be able to be what we call a faculty or what you call a staff here, you have to have a doctoral degree.
Okay. So kind of in a weakened form, we do have something similar in that we're supposed to teach at a level, one level below ourselves. So in reality, to teach in a master's, you should have a PhD.
But you could teach in the United States part-time with a master's. It's very common.
Yeah.
And you could teach people who are getting a master's because that's pretty much all you have. You don't have it's bachelor's degrees are almost unheard of. So we had sessionals, part-timers in the States who had master's degrees, had worked in the field X amount of time, were credentialed as a licensed counselor or something, and they did teach part-time for us.
So you've mentioned that a couple of times, not having a bachelor's degree. So what qualifies a person to get into a master's degree?
What qualifies them is typically, here's the typical way they do it. Now that we used to require, they take the graduate record exam, but there's no relationship between that exam and what we do in counseling. So most programs drop that requirement. So they have to have generally what we'd call a B level or above in grades with some degree of flexibility, letters of recommendation. Most programs, like if you're an accredited program, you're doing an interview, group or individual. I've done many of those. You're also looking at, have they done any work in the field? Have they had an undergraduate internship? Like at my university, Niagara University, a small university, it's a very good little place. My colleague, a close friend of mine and colleague in psychology, we created a pathway between psychology and our master's program. So the really good students could do their first year of 3-year master's program while they were seniors, and it counted for both degrees. But he would send me a lot of good students because only 10% of his students could jump into a PhD program. So I was getting some of his best. I was getting some of the best from the University of Toronto. But we also want to know, you write and tell us why you want to be a counselor. Give us 1 to 2 pages. You are going to do an individual or group interview and tell us why you want to be a counselor. You're going to get 2 strong letters of recommendation from faculty, or 1 faculty and 1 supervisor who tells us you're mature and you're responsible. So those are the ways that somebody gets in.
Okay. And a master's is 3 years then, did you say?
The accredited master's is now for clinical mental health and for marriage and family, and I think for rehabilitation counseling. 2 years for school counseling. There's some other small still, I think there's still a program in student affairs and counseling that's 2 years and whatnot, but most of them are 3 years. Now there's some issues. Some will cram three into two, but it's really hard to do that.
Yeah. I'm very conscious too of time. So I'm really just let's go back to research.
Mhm.
What do you enjoy? Qualitative, quantitative? You talked a lot about writing, so it sounds like there were some pretty solid systematic lit reviews going on there as well. What's your passion? What do you like doing? And I remember about not having boundaries and that curiosity. So it's not going to surprise me if you say all of the above.
All the above. Well, let me say, here's a weakness of the US system, Kathy. I'm embarrassed to admit this on tape, but I'm going to since I admit it to classes. I had 5 research courses as a doctoral student. I bet we spent one day on qualitative research. The rest was quantitative. And I know why they were doing that. They wanted to look like psychology. That is exactly what the counseling field patterned themselves after, even though in a lot of ways they're more akin to social work. All right. But I was always more interested. So I had not done qualitative, but when I was supervising, and I'm supervising master's degree students now, and they've got the most fascinating qualitative research projects. And there's a couple of my students here, our students here. I tell them, when you get through with this degree program, send that off to a journal. Like, for example, one student is comparing her emotional satisfaction. Each week, she would have a 1 hour Zoom talk with an actual friend and rate that on emotional satisfaction scale of 1 and a 1 hour conversation with her virtual AI friend.
Wow.
Yeah, it was fascinating, absolutely fascinating. And I've been looking at doing some of my own qualitative research because my passion is far more now. I'm tired of this number crunching stuff that half the time I can't even read some of what my statisticians tell me. But the passion for me is totally qualitative because you can get your hands on it. You can understand it. People in the field I get it. I'd say that. The other thing I really enjoy doing, and some don't consider this research, but my university, I've written a lot of books. I've written 10 counseling books. And I can get into a better flow writing a counseling book or chapter than I can writing an article because it's a different kind of writing. I think you get more, writing journal articles is great discipline work because you have to be so organized. You have to be thinking all the time about the style and all that and doing it in a short period of time and et cetera, challenging for a wordy guy like me. So I think right now, I love writing books, but I'm going to be doing a qualitative study on myself here soon, and something like that, and also working with a couple of colleagues on some research.
Well, seeing you've admitted to that, let me admit, most of my training was in qualitative.
Okay.
And so I regret a little bit not being able to do as much of the number crunching stuff as I would like to. So it's interesting how you get to research and where it kind of takes you.
But well, I'm actually kind of envious of you because I wish we'd spent more time. And I remember this one psychology professor I had, he was a lovely man. And he said, my passion is qualitative research, but I'm told we have to. And he said, yeah, I feel compelled by forces beyond me that we really look at quantitative research. And looking at back now, I can see why he said that. Qualitative is so much more interesting and so much more fun for me.
Well, I agree. That's why doing these interviews, I love doing it because I love talking to people. It's always been frustrating, like when you get a survey, even if it's a qualitative survey, you want to ask a question coming out of
Mhm.
what they have just said. So
Yeah.
that's where qualitative is so good. But I think for policymakers and kind of other stakeholders, they need the numbers. They need
Yeah,
to know what's going on. So
yeah.
I don't know. Do you have any sage words of advice for students or anybody watching this who's maybe tentative about doing a PhD or doing research or writing something? Do you have any sage words for them?
Well, I'll try my best. I think on my best of days, I have just enough sage advice for myself, but I'll do my best, Cathy. Um, I would say sometimes, and I'll speak for myself. I come from a really rural, very impoverished area, one of the poorest areas in the United States, where at the time I came through, very few people got university degrees. It was extremely rare, and it shows. I'm getting ready to go back there. But I would say sometimes you can surprise yourself. Sometimes you never know what talent, skills, and abilities you have until you really look at yourself. And I learned that about me. I learned that I was capable of far more than I had thought I was capable of doing. And if you find that you have that passion to go a little extra, to go into a doctoral program and come out being a researcher, maybe practicing part-time, but being a researcher, teaching full-time, doing those other kinds of activities, it's very possible you can do it, because I'm somebody who splunked his way through an undergraduate program and didn't become a good student until I was in grad school. I got into grad school based on strong letters of recommendations and a strong interview. But I found I could do research, and I found I enjoyed it. So maybe that you'll awake that researcher within yourself. And I would say when you do, believe in yourself.
I know I'm going backwards, but stuff that you've talked about is going around in my head. You talked about writing an article as against writing other genres. It's different.
Mhm.
Do you think as counselors, we do enough to disseminate our material in ways that are engaging not only to academics, but to others? I sometimes feel, uh, we encourage journal articles, full stop. And it's always kind of got to be in a very prescribed way. There doesn't seem to be the creativeness allowed that, in English literature. I know, well, you'll say, well, that's English literature, but there doesn't seem to be much encouragement. I know with my PhD, I turned it into a novel, but
Oh, yeah.
yeah, but that was
Wow.
and is considered reasonably rare and not kind of upheld particularly. I don't know. What do you think about that?
Well, I think, again, I can remember when that would have been the case in the mid 80s when I went into my program, but it's very different now. And again, it's the maturation of the profession. I think here in Australia, we need more generations like we got in the United States. Now, I've published poetry, but also in
Oh, wow.
counseling journals. Yeah, there's a creative arts journal in the States I've published in, and other things. I've written short stories, and published a couple of novels with Counselor as a protagonist. And kind of like you, I've enjoyed writing. And I find that writing across broadly keeps me fresh. I can't do one thing. If you say, Shannon, sit down for 5 hours and write, I can't do that. But I can write 2 hours on a book. I can write an hour or two on the journal article the next day. I can write, so I'll write 4 days a week, sometimes five if I can. Other than right now when we got all this bloody grading. But I think in the United States it's a lot easier to do than it is right now in Australia. What we have to do as profession in Australia, because we're trying to get those professional routes that we got in the States. So there's a lot of pressure on that. In time, I think we could do what you're talking about. I think the problem right now is this pressure to produce in ways that looks like some of the other professions like psychology and social work, to convince bureaucrats who know very little about the field that we belong there. It's what we had to do in the United States also.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so my granny used to say, slowly, slowly, catchy monkey. I don't know where that comes from, but slowly, slowly, catchy monkey. It seems like that's what you're saying.
Yeah, I think so.
So I think I've asked all the questions I was going to ask. Have I left something out that you would like to add that you think might be useful?
If I may, I think you've been
Yes,
very thorough.
please.
I think you've been very thorough and very organized, by the way. So I've enjoyed this. So let me toss something. I'm a great believer, that Viktor Frankl got it right and then Freud got it wrong. And now people maybe may throw things at the screen if you put them, but and Freud got some things right. But Frankl got something right in that I think meaning and purpose are really what's critical. And for our field, we are on this road, and it's hard to feel at times that we're having enough success. But I'm a hopeless optimist, if you'll pardon the malapropism, just like I was in the United States. And I was always a part of talking to elected officials and writing letters and later emails and all these other kind of things, and on and on and on. And because I really believed one day we'd get there, this Sisyphean task would get us there, and it did. And I believe the same will happen in Australia, albeit after I'm out of the picture, but it will. So I would say to people out there in the field, keep working, take your breaks when you have to, but believe in it. This is a process, and the process always takes longer than we like, but that's what you're on. It can happen here. If it happened in the United States against all the opposition we had, which was major, it can happen here also.
Okay, can happen. We've got to say it's going to happen. It will
It's going
happen.
to happen. It's going to happen.
You're going to be positive about it. Okay, I think I'll let you get back to your grading, but I really, really do appreciate your time. Actually, I got some of that as well. So happy grading. But thank you again. I really, really appreciate it.
Thank you, Cathy, and keep up all your good work, because it does make a difference. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Cheerio.